If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
What's up, babes?
And as the puck drops, the words that DC fans have been waiting to hear since 1974, the Washington Capitals are the 2018 Stanley Cup champions. It's not a dream. It's not a desert mirage. It's Lord Stanley, and he is coming to Washington.
Welcome back to Japers Rink Radio. I'm your host, Greg Young, and today we have Jfresh himself on, making, I believe, his third or fourth appearance already. So as I've said, for people that now make their third appearance, you're now officially friend of the podcast. So friend of the podcast, Jfresh, how you doing, man?
Not too bad. Friend of the podcast, enemy of the Capitals.
Yes. So I think you're I think one of the few Penguins fans that we're willing to have on. You and Adam Gretz, I think, are kind of the two that come to mind there. But so I think one of the things that you posed recently that I'm going to kind of bounce off of is I'm going to call like an orienting question to us here is you had posed recently on Twitter about how to build a contender, like how to actually do it. And so, because I think it's a little bit of a tricky balance here, right? I mean, one way is to get lucky, finish first, and draft a generational superstar, which the Penguins have done, the Capitals did, when they started, and obviously the Oilers have done, right? And got lucky with two. But I don't know. To me, it's interesting to think about how you actually build a contender. And I'm kind of curious. Obviously you posted it, but kind of your reflections on the answer to that question a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to think about that question. I think with the post you're referring to, where I basically said what you need to win in this league is at least two elite forwards, at least one elite defenseman. And the idea of how to, rebuild or retool or whatever just comes down to figuring out how to get those players on your lineup. I think that's kind of just like the bare minimum. There's obviously been plenty of teams that have had all of those things and have won absolutely nothing.
Yes.
And some that obviously haven't come even close. I think as an orienting thing to think about how teams rebuild and retool, it's just because with the failure of so many of these tanking, burn it all down, ice lineups of AHLers for a couple of years, a lot of those teams have been failing recently. And I think teams are kind of flailing around for an answer that isn't, taking the L on a tank for however long it takes to basically alienate your fan base and destroy your culture.
Yeah.
The thing is, most of the teams that we've seen win the Stanley Cup have been teams that followed that model, years ago. A lot of them in the 2000s, early 2010s. Even teams that have won recently have done so on the back of players that they drafted in the early 2010s. So teams right now don't really have much of a recent model to work on, and I think that they're looking at teams that followed the traditional rebuild path and are completely stuck in the mud and are kind of freaking out and trying to think up ways around that issue, including obviously the Washington Capitals.
Yes, and I think what's interesting in the Caps in this vein is I guess you would almost say they kind of thread the needle, right? In terms of I mean, you would say aggressively pursued value, which is easy for me to say because every NHL team tries to do that, right? And so I don't know how do you fit the Caps into this kind of this difficult equation of how to actually do it, given that it seems like the degree of difficulty of what they have done is just extremely high.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Capitals are an extremely well-run team. They have been for
Yeah.
years. I have said in the past, and Capitals fans have gotten annoyed at me about it, but it was a positive thing of if the Capitals management had the Penguins core to work with in that kind of, early 2020s period, I think that they would have been basically unstoppable. I mean, obviously we had the fall off of Kuznetsov, you had Backstrom and his injuries, of course. Considering the way that Crosby and Malkin, Crosby especially, were able to maintain their performance for so long, it felt like I was looking at the Capitals just constantly building out their bottom six, adding this young talent, adding guys that I wanted them to get, like Dylan Strome, for example.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Penguins were mangling their depth and making idiotic trades and getting older when they should have been getting younger. And even Carlson trade aside, like well before that, it was difficult to see, a team that's as well run as the Capitals do that. And so I guess the question now becomes, and again, this has been a big point of contention, is whether the Capitals have set themselves up for legitimate, sustainable Stanley Cup contention with this core, or whether, that equation that I pointed to, that incredibly simple equation of you need two elite forwards, you need an elite defenseman, whether they're eventually going to hit a ceiling on that in the same way that a team like the LA Kings have, for example, where you kind of wonder, are they too well run? Like, are they too good at not sucking? Have they managed to, pro and amateur scout their way into not tanking after their core has kind of fallen apart a little bit, to the extent that if they take the step back next year, that, I don't think it's out of line to think that they might, and they don't ever get the opportunity to draft an elite talent, are we going to be talking about a team that isn't necessarily going to end up being a cup contender? And obviously there's a lot of people that disagree with that, who think that the Capitals have built a sustainable contender. And we can get into that. But I think that's just kind of the fundamental question that dictates how teams like the Penguins and the Sharks and the Blackhawks and probably the Bruins pretty soon, and of course the Capitals, are kind of navigating, the next years after a core ages out and suddenly a cup window closes.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting for the team like that is, I mean, maybe I would suggest a slight reframe of this, which is that maybe you would say it's possible, but you just need a lot to go right at the same time. Right. I mean, like, look at the Caps this year, for instance, right? That they basically hit on every single one of their offseason moves. Right. And saw two of their, elite, or two of their key prospects that they needed to step into bigger roles this year do that, in Connor McMichael and Alexi Protas. Right. And so, and even then, right, and getting elite performances from, Logan Thompson and everything like that, I think there's still a lot of questions. Now, I think you could say, are there questions because, this was a surprise performance, or is this, I mean, you look at the stats, right, or the fancy stats and kind of the shot share metrics, and they have, I think the Caps at like a 52% expected goals team, and so that's not, I guess typically you would say the profile of a contender. So I don't know, I feel like I'm just adding layers of complication onto this, but I think it's when you don't have that kind of generational superstar, I think you need to hit on a lot of things, and you need to kind of, I don't know. I mean, it just doesn't, I mean, obviously those superstars don't grow on trees. And so, you would think there has to be some kind of other model. But you look at the teams that have actually won the Stanley Cup, and they typically have that kind of franchise orienting superstar. So I don't know. I feel like I've just kind of talked myself in a circle here. So help bail me out here, or maybe don't. I don't know.
Well, it's tough not to talk yourself into a circle with this Capitals team. I mean, fundamentally, This Caps team is going to end the season with probably around 115 points, which is a total shock. Even Capitals fans, I did the fan survey at the beginning of the year. Even the most optimistic Capitals fans were putting them in the high 90s, which was certainly a lot higher than the betting odds had them, than, prognosticators had them. But, I think that 115 points obviously has a lot to do with an elite goaltending performance that came essentially out of nowhere. I think people would have considered Thompson to have the potential to be, a middle of the pack starter, and suddenly he comes in and he's playing Vezina caliber hockey. Yeah. Obviously there's the shooting and everything, and there's a lot of players on this team who I think are finishing out of their minds. Even if you factor in things like all the pre-shot movement and stuff that maybe throws off shot share and public expected goals and everything. Like if you look at the sports logic numbers, they basically would peg this Capitals team, if you set aside the goaltending, set aside the finishing, as about a mid-90s team in terms of points. And so the question is, they obviously have a lot of talented shooters, even setting aside Ovechkin, and they have this goaltender who's putting together a Vezina caliber season. Is that a fair baseline to expect, or would it be shocking next year if the Capitals do maybe take a step back, even adding a guy like Ryan Leonard, and even with the young guys getting extra experience, are they going to maybe sink back to being potentially, a 100-point team, 95-point team, something like that? And then at that point, do we start to have more difficult questions to answer about whether the Capitals can be the model that proves that you don't have to bottom out? Or, alternatively, the fact that they got a guy like Pierre-Luc Dubois, can he be the number one center on a Stanley Cup winner? I mean, that would have been an insane thing to say last year, but he's obviously been sensational for them. Can a guy like Rasmus Sandin, for example, or Jacob Chikrin, if they decide to re-sign him, can they be an elite defenseman? These are all kind of outside shots, but obviously I think a lot of teams around the league are basically looking at the Capitals, and a lot of teams that are about to rebuild, including maybe the Penguins, there's been word about that, are thinking, oh shoot, can we actually do this without having to completely just nuke our organization for 3 years and risk getting stuck in the Buffalo zone or drafting a guy who's going to be miserable, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if the Capitals can make this model work, it will probably lead to a lot of delusional organizations absolutely destroying their chances of actually contending for several years because they think that they can just mid their way out of it. But again, I'm talking myself into a circle too. It's kind of impossible not to about this.
It's really hard, right?
Well, because we don't know what the Caps are going to look like in the next 5 years, or even next year, or even in the playoffs.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because I think you would say with the Caps, right, that we talk about organizational sustained success, right, as being a crucial factor, and then kind of bottoming out at maybe exactly the right time with still keeping that underlying success, right? And so it's interesting though, because you would say the Caps never really did that either, right? Because they have never had I think since Ovechkin, a top 5 draft pick, right? And so, maybe Ryan Leonard is going to be a superstar. I think the odds of that are low, but not impossible, right? And so I don't know. It's tough because, you just have – there's been so many kind of improbable things that have happened to the Caps, but the one thing that's kind of underlying it is really strong organizational structure that, they have logical succession plans for everything, right? And that's something that's always been striking about it, right? Their GM with the last 2 hires has been a GM in waiting, right? And McCullen, who is the assistant GM, and obviously Patrick, who's been in the Caps organization, the institutional Patrick hockey name, right? And so I don't know. I think one of the things that's been interesting is just the continuity at the Capitals level, and it's tough because other teams in the NHL, like it's tough to just say that you're going to do that from now on, right? Because the second you have failure, it's so easy to kind of recriminate and redo. And I feel like that's been a cycle. I don't know, Jack, that like the Penguins have seemed to fall into a little bit, and it's been interesting to kind of compare the two organizations on that level as well.
Yeah. I 100% trust the Capitals to build everything that needs to be in place for a team to be a cup contender, except for, conjuring these stars out of midair, essentially.
Yes.
And, again, maybe their pro scouting department will pull off, incredible trades again, or maybe, like you said, like Ryan Leonard, like maybe he's not TJ Oshie, maybe he's like a proper star,
Maybe he's a Kachuk. We don't know,
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. So, if Ryan Leonard is Matthew Tkachuk, and if Pierre-Luc Dubois, actually like fully puts everything together even more and becomes like an 85 or 90 point player, then maybe we're having a different conversation. I guess that's the thing. It's like I kind of entering the season, my outlook was basically, I think the Caps are going to have to bottom out, before they can really kind of build up. Like I liked what they had in place, but I looked at their prospect pool, and I'm no prospect guy, but I would go off of what smart people wrote about their prospects, and I would think Connor McMichael, Protas, Ryan Leonard, like all these guys, they're all great, and they're all players that you want on a Stanley Cup contender. I mean, Protas, even before he became, the
demigod, Zeus from Belarus, Alexei Protas, right? Was just a pretty good player, yeah.
Back when he was just, excellent defensive winger and playmaker. These are all pieces that you really want to have on a Cup team, and I 100% trust the Capitals organization to build around a core, a really great contending deep roster. The question is purely for me, just either can they get those top of the lineup pieces without bottoming out? And I think that they're too good an organization to bottom out.
Yeah.
Or do you actually need to have those top of the lineup pieces? Like if they can, PDO their way from being a 100-point team this year to a 115-point team, who's to say that they, with a deep enough roster, couldn't, not be the LA Kings, like couldn't just do that for a playoff run, and then suddenly, my heuristic model of how you win a cup in the Cap era just has fallen apart. I don't know.
Sure. Well, I mean, because the other thing that is interesting this offseason is, the Caps have, I think it's like $25 million in cap room. And yes, they're probably going to need to get the Chychrun deal done and do that. But they have the money if they want to go get Mitch Marner, assuming he's able to make it to free agency, and so, then that could complicate it further, right? Because then you could say maybe the organization needs to, kind of build around then, when a superstar kind of prize free, because it can happen, right? Look at Florida, right? Obviously they draft Barkov, but they get Tkachuk in a trade, right? From building other organizational pieces to make that trade, that maybe, in just the right moment, you can actually kind of land that superstar by just building an existing organizational structure that's really strong. No?
Yep. Yeah. So the only issue with that, of course, is that's leaving a lot up to chance. And
yes.
It's something that I've said in the post, like there's risk associated with every single model of rebuilding.
Yes.
And for the past couple of years, the idea has been, well, you manage the risk best by drafting high picks, but we've obviously seen the downfalls of that, that risk.
Yeah.
Again, the Capitals are a smart team, and building up all these assets and young players is a great way to make themselves properly lined up for, if a player of like a Jack Eichel, like the way Vegas got Jack Eichel, or the way Florida got Matthew Tkachuk, et cetera, gets onto the market, then I think that they would be well positioned to strike on it.
Sure.
It's just impossible to prognosticate that that's going to happen, and there's every chance that they keep on waiting, and every single star player that shows up just suddenly decides they want to play for a no tax team in the southern United States, and it's all moot anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's tricky, right? Because the Caps are, in a way, and I've made this point, I think, in other podcasts too, that they're almost like a middle market in a way that I think it really can appeal to a certain kind of player, right? Like a Pierre-Luc Dubois of like, they obviously, it's a team people are happy to play for, but it's not necessarily anyone's top of mind team to, well, maybe not every, like, but it's not a, you hear Mikko Rantanen saying, okay, he has 4 teams he wants to play for. I know the reporting on that is mixed, but you wouldn't say the Capitals are one of those teams, but you also would say, okay, if he had gotten traded to them for some reason, you'd have to imagine that, he might be open to it. So, you kind of wonder in that middle ground too, of like, maybe even the market can work for them, even if they're not always top of mind for everyone.
Yeah. There's the factor for adding those star players that, like I'm thinking of kind of the effect that Ovechkin and Crosby used to have on getting players to want to play there. If you're just kind of a deep team that doesn't have that star in place where they can think, oh, like I'm going to be the piece that gets them over the hill and leads them to win a Stanley Cup, then that might be an issue. I think a team that's kind of run into this is the Detroit Red Wings, where if you read people write about the Red Wings for the past couple of years, one of the premises of their rebuild has been, they'll be well positioned when superstars come available. And, you go back over the couple of years and you see, okay, for example, William Nylander. Well, when Nylander's contract, and then, William re-signed. And, you go down the list, and usually these
they
guys
almost all resign.
Usually
it's
they
rare
almost
that they get to market.
Or, in the case of, a guy like Rantanen, for example, like they sign with a team that already has a lot of pieces in place that's already, a cup contender. Like they're not rushing to go to a team where they might be the guy like Detroit or like Washington. But, again, maybe
I feel like we talk ourselves in circles here.
We keep talking about it in
it's
circles.
Tricky.
The answer is, who knows? There's risks associated with everything.
Yes.
Obviously, the Capitals are a fun wagon this year. I'm not nearly as concerned as I was with Vancouver last year of everything falling apart as soon as the bounces start to go the other way. I don't think that everybody's going to be asking for trades and at each other's throats and everything like that. No. And it might honestly be better for everybody if Alex Ovechkin breaks the record this season, and then, next season there isn't a lot of stuff looming over it. There's obviously going to be the expectations and everything associated with nearly winning the President's Trophy this year. But, for me, like one of the reasons that I harp on about PDO and unsustainable results so much, obviously people get angry about it because it's always for a lot of fans when their team goes on a heater
right?
like that.
You don't want to question. You think, oh well, like of course we deserve this success. We're our team, right? And it's it doesn't. Sports don't work that way.
Well, yeah. Well, and it's also for most fans when it happens to their team, it's kind of their first rodeo with it.
Yeah.
Whereas with me, where I'm noticing it happening every single year, whether it's the Capitals this year or the Canucks last year, and then it was the Red Wings were also a big one last year where I said all these numbers are saying they're going to collapse down the stretch, and then everyone was like, oh, look at this idiot, he thinks it's their pre-shot passing and all this stuff, and then of course they completely fell apart down the stretch. For a fan watching their team light the lamp and at incredible rates, I think the Capitals still have the highest shooting percentage in the analytics era. I don't know if they still had the highest PDO,
but they've done that for a few
since the
years,
1980s.
I will say. I'm not going to be that obnoxious fan about this, but and the complicating factor of me saying this is that last year their finishing was not very good. So and then obviously the personnel
they finished well
different.
for a few years. I don't know if they were the most efficient shooting team in like the past 30
so
years.
Believe it or not, I actually pulled these numbers in, I believe when I ran this in 21, that I think for 3 straight years they had finished in the top 5 in the salary cap era in terms of shooting percentage. So, it was one of those where I think you would hear Dom come on and complain that the Caps were breaking his model because of the pre-shot passing, but at the same time, they also did have usually pretty good underlying numbers, and they also had really strong superstar talent in a way that doesn't feel as true with this team right now.
Yeah, I think I might have been on a couple episodes talking about that back in the day, in the COVID years. But but anywho, I think it is what it is. Like I can only look at the numbers. I can only look at patterns that I've seen in the past and that have usually led me in the right direction. But I think one of the reasons that I do highlight this kind of stuff, and I do it when it happens to the Penguins as well, is that I think when the bounces stop going that way, there's an inevitable kind of crash out where fans, I think, get unrealistic expectations, and then they get really angry, really upset, really disappointed. And it especially happens with players more so than teams, because I think players will suddenly see their reputations really, really fall when all that's happened is that they've regressed to human shooting percentage instead of, something crazy like they had before. And in the case of the Capitals, I think the fact that, set aside all PDO, their season this year has been incredibly impressive, and a good part of the PDO comes from the goaltending, which was a specific thing that they, acquired in the off season. So
Yeah.
the question just becomes, are they one of the main cup contenders this year? We can get into that. I know that's a very fraught question.
Yeah, well, but let me ask it this way, because this kind of goes into my topic here, which is I'm going to start with the deadline, but I'm actually going a slightly different place with this, which is basically, so the Caps they got Anthony Beauvillier for a second round pick, whatever, right? He's going to be maybe a third line player. He can go up and down the lineup, fine. But to me, it was interesting that because I think you could make the argument both ways, that they should have done what they did and just kind of say, okay, this season's found money. Or, you could also, I think, make the argument that maybe they should have gone for it. Just with the kind of argument being that the Metro right now is really weak, right? Or not really weak, but it's definitely weaker than it was expected, right? You have the Devils that just lost two of their best players. The Canes made the Rantanen trade and, got worse for this year. Maybe not in the aggregate since, before the Rantanen trade, but, obviously that trade didn't help their odds this year when it was made. So I don't know. I mean, to me, it's like, if you want to say this is found money, does that mean that, maybe you should just take advantage of it and press your luck if you see a chance? Or, does it maybe make sense to just say, okay, let's make a small move here and there and just kind of keep growing organizationally? So I'm curious how you think about that question.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I was kind of gung-ho before the deadline saying that I liked the idea that the Caps were not going to dump a bunch of prime assets on
to get Brock Nelson
on rental to get Brock Nelson, or to both from the reason that they gave, which is that they didn't want to shake up the lineup too much and mess with the chemistry, which I like the idea that they're like, this house of cards is so delicate. If we move even one thing, the shooting percentage will drop 10 points.
Sure.
But no, and also in the interest of, this is a team that has been very deliberate with, keeping a strong stable of futures and good prospects. And if you're a team like the Capitals that trusts your amateur scouts, and they clearly really trust their amateur scouts, why take an arrow out of their quiver? And based on the price of Brock Nelson, for example, it looks like they would have had to give up a good prospect with him to get that deal done. When you're trying to build a sustainable contender window around these younger players. At the same time, though, like, you make a good point about the weakness of the Metro. Like, even the Hurricanes are looking vulnerable. It's not necessarily the hardest path through to the conference final that you're ever going to see. I still don't see the Capitals as a cup contender, and we can go back and play this clip 2 months from now and make me look like an idiot. I don't see them as a Stanley Cup contender at this point. It would really surprise me if they, let's say it would surprise me if they win more than one game in a conference final.
Okay.
Let's say
interesting.
That.
All right. I like that.
That's interesting. And I do think that they are vulnerable in the first round.
Yes.
But nonetheless, you still got Ovechkin. You still got John Carlson, who's playing way better hockey than you have any right to expect for him at this point in his career.
Yeah.
Did I say Josh Carlson or John Carlson?
I think you said John Carlson. You're good. Okay. I'm gonna allow it. I'm usually a pretty lenient host, so I'll give you that one.
You obviously got Logan Thompson playing out of his mind for the time being.
Yes.
I think that I would imagine that it was probably a very difficult decision to make in the Capitals front office of whether they were going to seriously go for it. But, maybe there just wasn't that much on the market that was going to really move the needle for them in any meaningful way.
Yeah, and I made this point elsewhere that the tricky part with the Caps and the deadline, in a way, is that, you have this roster that has a lot of, like, what I would call B to B plus players, right? And so you compare that to, I made this comparison to the Oilers or maybe some other teams that, the stars and scrubs approach a little bit, right? Teams that have a lot of really elite talent, but some holes, right? And, you would say the Caps, that was a little bit tricky because, getting like a depth defenseman or, a third line player, to me, it wasn't clear that was going to be a significant upgrade for them. And so in a way, the kind of a lot of B plus players makes a deadline harder, right? Because unless you're going to get Rantanen, or obviously Brock Nelson would displace someone, right? But like, you take Anthony Beauvillier, and the first person out of the lineup is Ethan Frank, who's been a very useful player for the Caps this year. And so it kind of adds a layer of complication to them on the deadline too, I think.
Yeah, somebody before the deadline was saying to me, "Oh, like, do you think the Capitals should get a third pairing defenseman?" I was thinking, like, what the hell's wrong with Trevor Van Riemsdyk?
He's actually been a perfect partner for Jacob Chychrun, I would actually say.
Yeah, you got kind of three very balanced pairings. Yeah, I understand getting guys for depth and everything, but I think that's a great point. Like, unless you were going to get like Rantanen or something, which I feel like Rantanen would not have been a good fit anyway. It doesn't really make sense to mess with the full lineup. And like you said, like, this is a team that's built on its depth, and basically just having like no weak links whatsoever, in the forward group or in the defense. So yeah, the philosophy of, let's give it a shot this year makes a lot of sense. But I just think in practice, probably they were looking at their list of targets and thinking, do we really want to push out, Nick Dowd for this? Do we really want to get Taylor Radish out of the lineup? Like, I can totally see the logic there.
Yeah, and it's tough because obviously then you also have Leonard coming in. We don't know exactly. Depends on how far he gets in, but that's gonna, then you have some kind of players beyond that, right? And it's you can kind of see the outlines of the argument. So I guess let's kind of zoom forward just a little bit, because I am curious your thoughts on Jacob Chychrun, because I think one of the things that Caps fans, I had heard commented that Jacob Chychrun always makes the most maximally aggressive play, whether you like it or not. And I'm a little kind of curious, because to me, it's been interesting that, you take him from Ottawa, and the Caps actually have him, I guess, in nominally a third pair role, although that's not really the right way to think about the Caps, because they are D player, all basically play roughly the same amount of minutes, 5v5. But I guess I'm a little curious kind of how you think the Caps have used Chychrun, that, what do you think is it that's really kind of allowed him to thrive on this team?
Well, honestly, I mean, with Chychrun, it's kind of the same situation of like, don't touch anything. Whatever's happening right now, like he's at like a 60% goal share. Just like let him do it and don't fuss with it. I mean, Chychrun has been one of the biggest examples all year of a guy who, you look at the underlying numbers, just purely like the on ice, expected goals, stuff like that, and you think, oh, he really isn't. It's not really working. The metrics are kind of worse than the other blue liners on the team. And then, well, they have 60% of the goals. He's putting up points. He's putting the puck in the back of the net. He's basically doing all the stuff that, you want Jacob Chychrun to be doing. Like, it wouldn't surprise you to know I've had to talk about Jacob Chychrun a lot in the past 5 years or so that I've been doing this, because every year there's a new thing with him. He was with the Coyotes, and then he was like the most prized defenseman in the league for a while because he was on that crazy $4.5 million contract, which I guess he's still on now that I think about it.
He is. This is the last year of it.
Yeah. So he was like the big prize. Everybody wanted him from Arizona. And then the team that finally got him was Ottawa for some reason. The team that, of course,
that always felt like a weird fit just from the start,
Yeah, like where there were the rumors like, oh, he actually used to play right defenseman, and then Craig Morgan actually asked him if he ever played right defenseman, and he said no, never a single time. And so they ended up with three, proper top four. Anyway, the thing with him is that when he's on, and he's not always on, he's been very inconsistent pretty much throughout the past 5 years. When he's on, he does so much stuff. Like, he's one of the toolsiest defensemen in the league. He kind of in a bit of a like prime Seth Jones kind of way. Like, he's just, you are constantly noticing him. He's taking a lot of shots. He's got that, that huge shot, obviously, and it's a very accurate one too. He likes to use it a lot.
Kind of a long shot, but it gets there, and it's always interesting. And it seems like he can place it really well when he has the chance to.
Yeah, and he, he's not a super creative player like with the puck. He's not gonna blow you away with his decision making, but he's super strong on the puck. He's got a good defensive stick. He's big in the defensive zone. Like you said, he's aggressive. He always kind of makes the maximally aggressive move. Like, he's like the perfect eye test defenseman. The thing with him, and this used to be a thing with Seth Jones back in the day, and it's kind of a thing with Brock Faber right now as well, who I'm writing about for Elite Prospects at the moment. But it's doing all kinds of stuff and then the end result of all that stuff can sometimes be a little bit questionable, and sometimes even make you think, should it be a defenseman who's doing all this stuff? Would we be better if maybe the forwards were doing some of this stuff? I kind of am not totally convinced that the underlying numbers, like the expected goals, are necessarily telling the full story with him. You not only have to consider the finishing and stuff like that, but sometimes blame and credit gets distributed by these models in ways that might not be accurate. I think it's very unlikely that Jakob Chychrun has been a less impactful player this year than he was for Ottawa last year, for example. That said, I guess the question just becomes, what is he going to be worth long term?
Yeah, how do you value this?
Like you said, if the Capitals are basically playing him as a spot up, third pair, second pair kind of guy, should they pay him $9 million? Yeah. When even right now they're probably not thinking, oh yeah, this is our stud 25-minute a night number one defenseman. And I'm sure, considering the amount that he's scoring, that there are going to be teams that see him as their stud 25-minute a night number one defenseman.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tricky one. I mean, it was a clutch acquisition. Jensen's been good in Ottawa. I think Jensen's been a lot better in Ottawa than he would have been in Washington this year. I think Chychrun's been a lot better in Washington than he would have been in Ottawa this year. Maybe he's your 1 year rental at the deadline that you didn't even have to pay very much for. And then maybe after the playoffs, maybe he has a breakout playoffs. I don't think we've ever actually seen him, with the exception of that very short Arizona Coyotes.
The bubble, right? I guess he was in there in the bubble.
Yeah, he would have been in there in the bubble.
Yeah.
Maybe he's one of those guys who's just going to pop in the playoffs, and they're going to be playing him a lot more time, and he's going to be big and physical and everything like that. And maybe this conversation is completely different in a couple months. For now, I would be skeptical about paying him like a number one defenseman long term when you're not even deploying him like that at this point. But
nope.
He's an interesting player for sure, and someone I've always found to be really interesting.
No, and I think I'm going to tie this back to another theme and then go to a different Caps defenseman I want to talk to you about. But to me, it seems like if the Caps were to re-sign him and give him a really high number, you would have to think that they'd have a plan in place for him to develop. Right. And that, but to me, the question then comes, is that something that Chychrun can do? And yeah, I guess that's kind of an interesting dilemma for the Caps, is that typically if they make a signing like that, and they were obviously heavily criticized for something like the Tom Wilson signing. In that case, I think fairly at the time, although you would definitely say I think it's worked out for the Caps, and 29 goal scorer as we're talking Tom Wilson. But sometimes I think you make a signing with the idea that we expect this player to develop and blossom into a role, because sometimes you just need that if a guy's going to have a certain AAV. And to me, the question there becomes, is this something that Chychrun can actually do? Yeah,
and I think Chychrun can munch minutes if called upon. He's done it before, but is he gonna?
Can he do that well?
Well, yeah. Is he gonna do the Provorov thing where he just bunches them to no real effect? And what happens? If right now he has the 60% goal share. If that drops, like his shot share is just over 50, his expected goal is just over 50. Obviously, he's a great scorer. That elevates things a little bit, but that doesn't explain why his line mates are shooting the lights out and why his goalie is Vezina caliber. I don't think anybody is saying, the reason that Logan Thompson should win the Vezina is, it's just all Chychrun. He's the Chychrun merchant. So what happens when that drops and he, maybe goes back to being a decent, second pair player? And, the second pair player, the Capitals seem to kind of think that he is. Oh, but you're paying him. You gave him the Darnell Nurse contract.
$8.5 million or whatever, right? Yeah. It's tricky. But one player I do, keeping on the Caps blue line a little bit, is I am going to ask you a Penguins versus Caps question in a different way, which is I think with Erik Karlsson and John Carlson, to me it's interesting. So Erik Karlsson's actually a year younger than John Carlson, which is something that still kind of blows my mind because I feel like I've thought about Erik Karlsson for a long time. And so I would say Erik Karlsson has had a very up and down year, whereas or I guess mostly down except for maybe the Four Nations. But John Carlson, as you mentioned, has really seen kind of a career blossoming. And I'm a little curious, kind of reflect on those two, because obviously you would say Erik Karlsson at the height of his powers is going to be well beyond what John Carlson could do. But to me, you would say John Carlson these days is probably the more effective player. So I don't know. I was kind of curious. Those two players, kind of comparing the two and the organizational structure around them is interesting to me, and I'm kind of curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm deeply impressed with what John Carlson has been able to do, especially he has managed to go from being the pure offensive defenseman that he looked like in the early 2020s, I guess, or the late 2010s, early 2020s. He looked like he was just kind of the pure, big shot on the power play, like pass it to Ovi kind of guy, and who genuinely did drive offense at an elite rate, but gave a lot back defensively. I think he's kind of progressively tidied up the defensive game enough, like really kind of enough is the key thing. I think he's simplified things quite a bit. He's not afraid to kind of make the chip play now, where he would maybe have gone for broke with a home run pass or something like that. He's still great in the defensive zone. Great in the offensive zone. Sorry. He's producing well. He's contributing to the rush and everything, and he's doing so without having the Erik Karlsson-esque impact or lack thereof on defense. Whereas I think Karlsson, for all that's great about him, was always a terrible defensive player. Even back in the day when analytics people would say, oh, Karlsson's actually he's good defensively. You don't realize how good he is defensively because they were using shot attempts instead of scoring chances and expected goals to look at it. Even when he was winning Norris trophies, it was always because he was just so transcendently good offensively that it counteracted how poor he was defensively. I think on a team like the Penguins that just have no structure whatsoever, and have, I think, quite intentionally, diabolically added a guy like Matt Grzelcyk to be their shutdown partner for Karlsson.
That's a bad idea. I didn't realize, is he playing with Karlsson?
He has been in the past. I mean, basically the past, around the deadline. I mean, the Penguins lineup is a bad idea. The Penguins lineup right now is basically, a disaster in terms of like they just have random role players playing with Karlsson and Letang. But there have been minutes, pretty significant minutes throughout the season where it's been Karlsson and then a guy like Grzelcyk next to him. Or, even when Karlsson and Pettersson have been playing together, Pettersson, very stable first defenseman.
Yeah.
I think both of them kind of have taken liberties, and I think Karlsson is obviously the king of taking liberties defensively in order to create offense. I think people sleep on just how good he still is offensively.
Okay.
And the Four Nations, I think I would almost disagree that, the Four Nations was kind of the high for him. I think the Four Nations was just people were kind of seeing him with structure around him and recognizing, that's that kind of stuff.
There's still a useful player there. He's not being put in a position in Pittsburgh in a way.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is what Karlsson still does on a night-to-night basis. Like he's still, sure. And I obviously if the Penguins can get a good return for him, then I'd be more than happy for them to receive it. If you have to like add a pick to get rid of Karlsson, I actually kind of love Karlsson as a tank commander, just because he's so entertaining to watch. Like he makes plays with the puck that no Penguins defenseman in a long time has made, including Chris Letang. Like he's that offensively talented. He's still a great skater, all this stuff.
Sure.
But he doesn't give a crap at all defensively. And I think if he did, he has no idea what he's doing.
How to even do that, how to, yeah.
And that's just the way he is. And the Penguins at first accidentally and now intentionally, I think, don't have anybody next to him that knows what they're supposed to do defensively, and especially how to cover for a guy like Karlsson, who's just going to jet up the ice and stand around looking stunned, when the puck's in his zone.
Yeah.
So you end up with, again, not a net negative player, and still I think a valuable player and a player that on a team that had structure would be, like if he was on the Tampa Bay Lightning or something, I think he would start till he would look like Four Nations Carlson and not like this one. But like to bring it back to the comparison with John Carlson, I think John Carlson is doing what his team needs him to do to win. Like he's evolved his game in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think Carlson is just, he's one of the best offensive defensemen of all time, and he is not going to change his game whatsoever to adjust to this situation. And the Penguins have nothing in place to cover up for that.
Yeah. And I would also say, too, I mean, we talk about the Caps as an organizational success story. And I think that John Carlson's primary partner these days, Rasmus Sandin, is probably a good example of that, right? In terms of, I think sometimes the stereotype is that an offensive defenseman like John Carlson, who, yes, has cleaned up his defense, but yes, still has holes in his game there, needs a pure defensive defenseman guy to just be back there and be in the right lanes, like a Trevor Van Riemsdyk kind of type. But actually, what's been interesting is I think sometimes what you actually need for a player like that is like a Rasmus Sandin, a kind of jack of all trades, a guy who can, kind of make the right play and has the skating ability to outskate any mistakes that Carlson's going to make. And, to me, it's been interesting to see the growth of Sandin because they have him signed again for an eminently reasonable contract. And so, maybe you say, okay, it's also an interesting model, I think, as to how to pair an elite player, an elite kind of offensive player still like John Carlson. It doesn't have to just be a slow kind of sturdy, boring defenseman, but it can also be a guy that has a lot of skill, but also has the ability to kind of cover up mistakes when necessary.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in New York with the difference that they get when they play Keandre Miller with Adam Fox versus Ryan Lindgren. Or like they presumably will get with Carson Soucy, because I'm assuming that is going to be their new Ryan Lindgren for him. Yeah, totally agree. And Sandin's glow up this year. I mean, his numbers were very poor last year, especially defensively. And they were poor basically from the minute that he showed up in Washington through last year. And I was thinking, like maybe this was a guy that the numbers were wrong on. Like they always said that he was kind of a sneakily decent two-way player, and he was kind of falling apart a little bit in Washington. I thought, shoot, like this is gonna show me up. And then, he's just been quite balanced, I think, in Washington. There's still warts to his game, but I think that he's developed very well in the way that Washington at this point seems to be just really good at turning these guys into effective players, almost like the Pittsburgh Penguins used to do back in the Jim Rutherford days. But those are very long ago, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. All right. Well, let's do an Ovechkin question, then we'll take a break and then kind of wrap up a little at the end here. So I'm gonna ask you it this way. So I think one of the things that the Caps have, so obviously Alex Ovechkin has been, what he is, right? Which is a guy that can still, the shot is still there. The passing actually I think it's always been better than I think he's been given credit for, and all that. And so I'm a little curious about how you think about line mates with someone like Alex Ovechkin, because to me it's been interesting because you see obviously Strome and him have seemed to work, but it's not always the most consistent, and sometimes the way I see it is that Strome has the weight of the world lifted off of him when he's not skating with Ovechkin. So I don't know, how do you think about the right line mates to have with someone like Ovechkin, and kind of how does that work, and how do you think the Caps have been able to balance that with the development and obviously slow down in Ovechkin skating to combine with the obviously always spotty defensive zone coverage that he has?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Ovechkin and Strome is not exactly the fastest duo in the NHL. It's tricky because, like, I've been impressed by Ovechkin this year, not just from obviously he's scoring piles and piles of goals, but I think his game has actually kind of resuscitated a bit outside of the goals and in a way that I wasn't expecting. Like kind of like looking at his game in the summer, I was basically seeing like, oh, he's slower. He's not, he's just kind of waiting for other people to do all the work for him. He, he's having a tougher time to get open. He's not able to shoot the puck as much just because he's not getting to spots that he needs to do to get there. And he's not passing the puck well. So I kind of figured that he was just going to hobble along until he just kind of eventually got the record. And I've been impressed. I mean, this year he has, legitimately, obviously, the underlying numbers aren't great, whatever. They never have been, or not never, but they haven't been necessarily lately. But in terms of just what he's doing on the ice, I think he's doing quite a bit more. He's been a lot more dangerous off the rush than he was a bit more recently. It's tough to figure out a line mate for him. Like you almost just kind of don't want to mess with what works. I mean, Dylan Strome in theory is a player that you would think would, that kind of seems like a good duo just because Strome is a good defensive player. He's obviously a terrific passer as well. You have a guy like Tom Wilson in there with them who can do the dirty work that neither of them are necessarily too inclined to do. I think the speed point is obviously an important one because Ovechkin at this point isn't going to be winning a lot of races. Strome has probably never won a foot race in his life going back to kindergarten.
Nope.
But, at the same time, if those two things are compatible, then it wouldn't surprise me to see Ovechkin's minutes maybe get tamped down a little bit in the playoffs. I mean, one of the things that I'm curious about watching the Capitals in the first round, last year, Corey Schneider, our mutual friend.
Yes. We love Corey here.
Who tracks every game of the playoffs. Ovechkin was the only player in his entire data set from last year's playoffs that didn't have a single scoring chance or assist to a scoring chance in the playoffs, who played like above 50 minutes or something.
Okay.
Like, no, everybody else, like your Luke Glendennings, like all down the list, Ovechkin was the only one who was able to generate literally nothing at 5-on-5 in the playoffs.
And against the Rangers, who, were not, even last year when they were winning the President's Trophy, you wouldn't say they were like an elite defensive team,
Yeah. So, I guess that's kind of the question is, how is it going to look in the playoffs? Fortunately, like you alluded to, the Capitals have done such a good job of building up depth that they are able to kind of move pieces around and figure out, other options if the Strome and Ovechkin duo doesn't work, or if they need to drop Ovechkin down the lineup, or if he's buzzing, if they want to elevate his minutes and, et cetera, et cetera. It's just such a tough player to kind of figure out a line around at this point in his career.
Absolutely. All right. With that, we're going to take a quick break. And then on the other side, we went way long on this. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions on the other side, a little bit more NHL-wide topics. So stay tuned. Welcome back. Still here with Jfresh. And so, Jack, let me ask you about I'll ask a playoff-y kind of question, which is, so right now there's a glut of teams in the Eastern wild card. And, I guess, like, let me ask it this way, which is, if you're coming from the Capitals' perspective, who do you not want to get out of there? Like, who would be the team you would say, okay, that's the team I would say the Caps shouldn't want to play, just either because they're secretly good or because they might pose a matchup problem for them?
Well, it depends if you're going off of vibes or if you're going off of numbers, because
well, let's do both.
if you're going purely off, like probably one of the only teams that's kind of running hotter and, happier than the Capitals these days is probably the Columbus Blue Jackets.
Yeah.
Just absolutely found money. There was no reason to expect that they were going to be in this position. There's, certainly, no doubt about it, a big element of good fortune going on there. I mean, they're going to be ultimately one of the only playoff teams and probably the only playoff team in the Eastern Conference that is below a break-even expected goal team. And that's,
I think they're like 48 last time.
Yeah,
they're like a decent amount below.
Yeah, and this is using the Sport Logic model too, not the public one too. So it's not like we're looking at cross ice passes and things like that. Yeah. They're firmly in that getting out chance but outscoring quadrant, and it's not like they have a name brand goaltender that you can point to. That's they're not the Winnipeg Jets. And their scorers. Obviously they've had some great breakout seasons, but I think that they have a lot of young guys in particular who have been shooting the lights out this year in a way that is not necessarily reflective of process, and which I would expect will probably start to tamp down soon. I love the story of the Blue Jackets. I hope
how could you not, right?
Are successful in the playoffs, but as long if you don't feel any remorse about raining on their parade, then I think that they would be the preferable option.
Sure.
Even then a team like the Rangers, because the Rangers obviously, like, they're the ultimate high ceiling team. So if they work their way back into the mix, then you never know what's going to happen. Whereas with a team like the Senators, for example, obviously they're the Senators, so it feels a little bit ridiculous to be like, shaking in your boots about the friggin' Senators. But under the hood, they were pretty good last year.
Yeah.
They got let down by just horrific goaltending. And they are pretty good this year. Like, they are, in terms of pure just underlying, like just expected goal differential per game, but with this sport logic model, they are about in line with the Washington Capitals and the Winnipeg Jets. Mm-hmm. And that sounds ridiculous, and it is slightly, because they've obviously underperformed that by a lot. Like, there's a reason that they're in this wild card race right now. But they are, I think, sneakily a good team. The much maligned Nick Jensen, I think, has actually helped Thomas Chabot quite a bit. Jake Sanderson is a terrific defenseman, has proven all of the NHL equivalency model people very wrong about his game. I think is going to deal with playoff hockey very well, assuming he gets the chance to play some anytime soon. There's a reason Team USA picked him. And then in net, they have a name brand goalie. They have Linus Ullmark. He's got a mixed record in the playoffs, but he has a record in the playoffs, and he's not Joonas Korpisalo. Although now that I say that, I'm remembering Joonas Korpisalo in the 2020 playoffs.
And the bubble, right?
Yeah, and blah blah blah. Brady Tkachuk, all that stuff too. So
something playoffs. He seems like a perfect fit. Yada yada, right?
Yeah, and they're a hungry team as well, and they're an inexperienced team, and we've seen inexperienced teams like that who are properly good teams stumble when they get to the playoffs. But it's not like this Capitals squad is the most experienced postseason hardened team of all time either. Like, aside from their stars, there are a lot of guys, like Chychrun,
who've never won a playoff game, right?
Who've never won a playoff game.
Everyone
who've never played in a playoff game. Yeah. So, I feel like the Senators' youth effect and green effect is maybe not necessarily going to stand up. Obviously, the Capitals are a huge team. They're, they have a lot of advantages in a lot of ways, but I think the Senators are maybe the closest thing you could think of to a team that could maybe be the ones that, expose the Capitals a little bit in terms of just how hot they've run this season. If they run into a team that's kind of roughly equal in terms of just owning the share of scoring chances and things like that, if that crosses over to the playoffs.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're gonna take a step back. I just got two more questions for you. And so and one is about a concept I kind of thought I've been thinking about for a while, and the other is the playoff format. So I'm going to start with playoff format because I know you've talked about this a little bit, which is I think one of the things that's been interesting to me is that you right now I would say you have a glut of talent kind of in the Atlantic and Central divisions, right, in each conference, and so you're going to get 2-3 matchups, I think, in both of those that are just going to be two really good teams and only one's going to get out. Whereas if you had a kind of 1 through 8 seeding, you might have been able to avoid that to some extent. And so I guess I'm a little curious, kind of, your thoughts on that, and the kind of difficulties that the playoff format seems to bring, because obviously the NHL wants to guarantee some rivalries in the first round, but it just seems like you kind of end up with this trade-off between that and also a first round matchup involving Tampa and Florida potentially, which just doesn't seem right for that level. And so I'm a little curious how you think about that question.
Yeah, I've really soured on the playoff format, and maybe it's because my team has absolutely nothing to do with the playoffs right now that
Sure.
I feel liberated to talk about it. Because usually when people complain about the playoff format, it's because their team is wronged by it in some fashion.
Look at the Caps and the Penguins, right? 3 straight years of the teams in the peak of their powers, and the winner of that each year went on to win the Stanley Cup, right?
Yeah,
that was a crazy result.
And the funny thing about that was that because the Penguins would win all these series, Penguins fans would tell Capitals fans to stop coping when, you're just coping like with your loss. That's why you're complaining about the playoff format. But the funny thing is that the 2016 Penguins actually were 16 and 17 Penguins were screwed by that playoff format in round one both times, because they played, I think they were the second seed in both those years, and then they played the third seed in the conference, which is or just purely by points. I think it was the Rangers the first time, the Jacks the first time. Yeah. So the Penguins were also getting screwed by that format. It's just we won, so you guys were the whiners. In any event, I think what the NHL has ended up with is they're getting rid of too many good teams early on. Okay. And everyone goes crazy for the first round. We love the first round. Oh, it's endless hockey and everything like that. But I feel like for a lot of people, it just kind of peaks in the first round and then they lose interest. Like their team gets eliminated. Like all the fun of the first round with all the hockey being on, I think dissipates. People's teams are eliminated and suddenly there's bigger gaps between games. They're not really paying attention anymore. And I think one of the reasons that they maybe don't is because teams that they would be interested to watch are getting knocked out in the first round by other teams that they would be interested in watching. And so the idea of having one of Colorado and Dallas or one of Tampa Bay and Florida just knocked out in round one, especially because I just don't think we've had this playoff format for 11 years now, and we just heuristically have not understood that losing in round one is not the same as what it was before they changed the format. Like we talk about, this team couldn't get past round one. Like it's like if the Stars lose this year against the Avalanche in triple overtime of Game 7,
there shouldn't be a shame in that, right?
We'll be like, oh man, everyone was talking about the Stars team and they lost in round one. It's like, well, they lost in round one, but they lost in round one in a series that could have been the conference finals in another situation. But all that matters is, they only made it to round one. And that, you can't really say that out loud too loudly, because it just sounds like you're like a Leafs fan. It sounds like you're a Leafs fan in disguise. Like it sounds like you are you're Kyle Dubas wearing the smiling mask in front of you while you complain about it. But it is ridiculous. And I think we've kind of proven that the rivalries that are built by it are not actually nearly as compelling as we thought that they were. I think that the trade-off has been negative, and I think it's probably about time to do away with it, just because I think the NHL benefits from having better teams in the playoffs later on.
I'm not going to, I don't necessarily agree with this argument, but let me give you the counter argument to this as far as I can see it, which is we talk about NHL or hockey being a random sport, right? And so one of the, I guess the theoretical benefit to this is that, yes, it's not good to have Florida and Tampa, one of them lose in round one, or Colorado. I guess the better example is going to be Colorado and Dallas, right? But at least with this format, you get that matchup. And because hockey is so random that, you're not necessarily guaranteed that matchup in round two, because one of them could get PDO'd to death in the first round or something like that. So this way you at least get that matchup. So kind of what would be your thoughts to that argument?
I mean, it is nice to have a guaranteed Florida versus Tampa, but I think it would be even better to have that matchup later on. I think the trade-off of the risk of not getting that matchup every single year is compensated for the possibility of having that matchup be the conference final. It feels like too often lately the conference final has been a matchup that you actually don't really care about that much between kind of two teams that don't have a lot of history. Like you don't have this possibility of having two contenders from the same division face off in the conference finals, which I think is a shame, because often those would be the most exciting series. Like if we had Florida versus Tampa Bay in the conference finals, or we just use the exact same example, Dallas and Colorado, Vegas and Colorado, all this stuff, it would be a lot more entertaining to have it later on. And I think it's worth the trade-off of having that, because I think a lot of people are kind of checking out, in that middle zone of the playoffs, who aren't diehard lunatic hockey fans like us. Like they're they're not tuning in every day to watch Florida Carolina or what have you, or just these matchups that maybe they would rather see in the second round or even in the first round. compared to watching two juggernauts go at it. And honestly, I want to see better teams go further in the playoffs. Like when I'm watching the playoffs, I want to see more of the better teams. There's a certain extent in hockey where you don't get that because, randomness and everything like that. But a format that almost assures that quality cup contenders are going to get knocked out early and teams that don't really have a prayer are going to survive a little bit later on is not something that I really have any interest in at this point.
No, for sure. I mean, I'll say as a Caps fan this year, we're okay with the playoff format, right? Because you get a wild card team, you get potentially a beat up team in the Metro in the second round, and then let Florida and Toronto and Tampa knock the hell out of each other, but I think for Caps fans I would say look back on years past, where there's these second round matchups with the Penguins that didn't have to exist, right? And it would have been nice to maybe see that matchup in the conference final to at least get some of these stupid narratives over. So these things always go full circle, and at some point a stupid playoff format, it's just a stupid playoff format regardless of how your team is affected in any one year. So that would be kind of my plea to Caps fans on that one. But Jfresh, let me ask you one last question here, which is, and I asked this of all of our national guests, especially the analytics focused one like you, which is this Kevin Woodley piece about the lower save percentage and how offenses are changing. I sent you the link to that before this, and it's something that he's been on the PDOcast before, and it's got me really thinking about this question. The statistics still hold that this is going to be the lowest save percentage since the first year post-lockout, which you should ignore because that was the year that penalties skyrocketed. And so really we're actually looking at the lowest save percentage that year excluded since I believe 1995-6. And so I don't know, like what's your make of that? And I'm a little curious kind of what you think that might portend or might not to how teams are kind of developing and changing the way they think about offense and generating it.
Well, I think you can point to the growth of analytics in front offices as a big part of it. Teams aren't wasting shots. They're not just looking for turnovers. And I think, you look at blue liners who take a lot of shots. They need to be scoring on a bunch of them to make it worthwhile at this point. Like your Jacob Chikrins, for example. If those pucks aren't going in, then those are just empty calorie shots. Fortunately, he's getting a lot of them in. The changing shot numbers it's interesting, and it means that you have to recalibrate a lot of things in the same way that we had to recalibrate a lot of things about production in the past couple of years, just because of how quickly scoring levels were changing, where like point per game seasons meant a lot more when there was 4 people who had them compared to when there's 30 people who have them. Save percentages are obviously the big one, and I think it makes it even more important for us to understand the effect that team defense has on save percentage. Because when we're talking about save percentages that are close to that magical 900 mark that is really eye popping, you see people talking about, oh, he's a 900 goalie or something like that. I think it makes it even more important to have an understanding of, okay, but the effect that the team defense in front of this player is really having an impact on what that number is, and whether that means that he's playing poorly or whether it means that he's doing the best that he can in a really tough situation. I think in the case of the point shots going down, I think that points to a broad trend that we've been able to observe, and Kevin writes about it in that piece. I would say that this does bring up something that I do like to warn people about sometimes, which is when numbers shift very suddenly. An example this year is the giveaways and takeaways. And, I think shots also are down quite a little bit suddenly this year. There's a bit of a jolt in that. One thing that people should keep in mind is that the NHL is shifting how it tracks certain numbers. I don't have, I'm not at liberty to say, and I don't have detailed information on what the details of how those changes are happening are. Whether it's automation or just different standards or different technology or things like that. But what I would say is that when you notice leaps in different numbers from season to season, you do need to take that into account. Like if, I've seen so many posts of people saying like, oh, this player has leapt from 7 takeaways per, per 60 or whatever to 14. Like, he's falling apart. And it's like, well, no, they actually, this season, the standard for giveaway has, massively changed overnight. And you need to take that into account. Same thing happens sometimes with, there's certain expected goal models where they don't shift the baseline from season to season. And so what you end up with is some seasons where the top goals saved above expected leaders have like 50 goals saved above expected, and the average goalie has like 15 goals saved above expected. And then there's some seasons where it's just the opposite. And a lot of that comes down to how shots are being tracked in that season, how players are finishing in that season, stuff like that. But the result of that is you end up with these lists of, here's the ranking of the top goals saved above expected seasons in the past 15 years. And then they're very heavily tilted towards like 1 or 2 seasons in particular, when these are really things that you kind of have to compare within the season sample. So I would say the same thing is probably true for anything that the NHL tracks, basically. Make sure that you're staying conscious if you're trying to do something with stats like that. Make sure you're staying conscious of, when there's a big shift happens and it makes more sense that it would be a change in how it's being measured compared to, is everybody in the NHL, like, did they just get a memo that they need to give away the puck 10 times more per game? Some people will try to galaxy brain it and they'll say, oh, maybe there's strategic changes that are happening in people in the game that are making them give the puck away 7 times more per 60 minutes. It's like, probably not. It probably just means that the guy who ticks off when a takeaway happens is given different instructions by the league, or maybe there's like a little robot man who's doing it now instead. I don't know. I have no insider information. Anyway.
Yeah, it's hard, right? And it's also hard because, I mean, for the longest time, you would see swings just between buildings and, like different scorekeepers, right? I've even heard this year with the Islanders, right, that there's a bit of a debate about, how to exactly track what they're doing, because it seems like their numbers have been skewed for whatever reason. And, that last year maybe Sorokin was actually better than people thought, or, it's been really interesting because there's so many layers and variables, and it's one of the tricky parts with hockey being a kind of low scoring as compared to other sports in a way, is that when you measure all these ancillary things, they can swing wildly based on both the kind of context of the sport and also just the nature of how hockey works as a kind of mechanics as a sport, and that's just, it's something that's always tricky to balance.
Yeah, you just want to have as much information as possible so that you can make informed analysis based on it. Like for like the example of the Islanders thing that you brought up, that insight only really comes from, noticing things in, so the trickles of private data that have been shared online and thinking, oh, I would rather know what the deal is with this than just put out the public numbers, say those are right, ignore anything else. I'd rather have more information. And in the case of the Islanders, like, I talked to people who have access to that data, and they told me that they were finding inconsistencies with the Islanders numbers and with their goaltenders specifically, and saying, oh, the Islanders defense is worse than the public models say that it is. And, I respect that they have access to more accurate input data. So that's something that I'm going to listen to. And it's another one of the reasons when we're talking about big swings over time, that the work of somebody like Corey Schneider, who's one guy who's been tracking all this stuff over time. Like, I have no issue comparing stuff year over year, scoring chance levels, player performance in these metrics year over year whatsoever, because
the same
I know
guy doing it,
it's the same guy who's been doing it since the mid 2010s. So like, I can put together a scatter plot of scoring chances and stuff for players for the past almost 10 years and know that I am looking at the same baseline all the way through, which is not always necessarily the case with the NHL.
One of these days, I'm going to get Corey on and I'm going to have him break down exactly what he does, because it is just fascinating to hear. And I it might be, it won't be a Capitals themed podcast as much, but, I'm just, that's something that I want to do. And we might have the works for Corey in with a bigger episode. So with that, stay tuned. But Jfresh, man, this has been a blast. We ran wildly over time, but, I think this has been a lot of fun, and I feel like I learned a lot. So where can people kind of find you in your various musings on things. And I'll before I let you unleash on that, I just want to say that Japers, Rink, we know that you have a Patreon, and that we are proudly happy to support that. And so that comes recommended from us.
Well, I appreciate that.
Of course.
Yeah, Jfresh on Twitter. Still, I'm sorry, it's just more engagement. Still, I feel like hockey is the one place.
Yeah, I hate that
it's
that's
the one
true,
place where
but
the
it is still
non-crazies
true for
are.
me too. Yeah.
The hockey Twitter is the one place where it is kind of non-crazy still. It is the people who just want to see what Elliot Friedman is putting out there. Theoretically, I have the blue sky, but I'm very bad about. I just hate replicating posts that I make on Twitter and then just having to copy and paste them into a different platform. But maybe I'll get better about it this summer. I'm still writing for Elite Prospects. We're working on a story right now. It's our ranking of the top 23 and under players in hockey. So it includes prospects as well as players. It's like kind of a prognostication of their future performance and not just how they are right now. So I've been working on that with Mitch Brown and Devin St. Louis, and it's been a really interesting process. I think that's probably going to drop around St. Patrick's Day, so look forward to that.
Cool.
And then stuff down the stretch. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break. I'm heading overseas for a couple weeks, but when the playoffs come around, I will be writing playoff previews for them as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, if you've made it through this whole episode, you could follow me at @GregY_JR on Twitter. I post there still. But you can also follow me on Blue Sky at Greg Young, which I'm happy I got that one. You can follow the show at @Japers Radio on Twitter. If you like it, please rate or subscribe, review. We got some big guests coming up, including a former co-host who might be making a bit of an appearance with me for a little bit here. So with that, stay tuned for next week. I'm looking forward to welcoming everyone back. So a disclaimer at the end of the show. I just want to clarify that I am not going to be taking money or any form of payment or remuneration for doing this show. There obviously have been ads in this show, but it's important to clarify due to my visa situation and the fact that I would like to stay in Denmark for at least a little bit here, that I'm taking no money nor any kind of remuneration for this show. So there you go.